Continuing Theseus from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. But Archus writes that there were two Arcadians in the army of Castor and Pollux, the one called Academus, the other Marthas. The first, that which is now called Academia, was then named Academia, and the village Marathon had its name from the other, who, to fulfill some oracle, voluntarily offered himself to be made a sacrifice before battle. As soon as they were arrived at Aphidna, they overcame the enemies in a set battle, and then assaulted and took the town. And here they say, Alycus, the son of Sciron, was slain, of the party of the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, from whom a place in Megara, where he was buried, is called Alycus to this day. And Herias writes that it was Theseus himself that killed him, in witness of which he cites these verses concerning Alycus, and Alycus upon Aphidna's plain, by Theseus in the cause of Helen slain, though it is not at all probable that Theseus himself was there when both the city and his mother were taken. Aphidna being won by Castor and Pollux, and the city of Athens being in consternation, Menestheus persuaded the people to open their gates and receive them with all manner of friendship, for they were, he told them, at enmity with none but Theseus, who had been first injured, who first injured them, and were benefactors and saviors to all mankind beside. And their behavior gave credit to those promises, for having made themselves absolute masters of the place, they demanded no more than to be initiated, since they were as nearly related to the city as Hercules was, who had received the same honor. This, their desire, they easily obtained, and were adopted by Aphidnus as Hercules had been by Peleus. They were honored also like gods, and were called by a new name, Alycus, either from the cessation of the war, or from the care they took that none should suffer any injury, though they were so great an army within the walls. For the phrase Lycos, a kind is used of those who look to or care for anything. Kings for this reason perhaps are called Anactes. Others say that from the appearance of their star in the heavens, they were thus called, for in the Attic dialect this name comes very near the words that signify above. Some say that Athra, Theseus' mother, was here taken prisoner and carried to Lacedaemon, and from thence went away with Helen to Troy, alleging this verse of Homer to prove that she waited upon Helen. Athra of Theseus born, and large-eyed Clymene. And some say that most of the entities that people call gods are really human heroes that have been exaggerated to the point of being treated like that way. And it turns out there was a king in Egypt named Horus. And there was an ancient king in Enki and Enlil were actually titles of kings. And then you ended up with cults arise like they weren't. Now, people were named after divinities too, or entities that they treated like gods. So others reject this verse as none of Homer's, as they do likewise the whole fable of Lycus, who, the story says, was the son of Demophon and Laodice, born secretly and brought up by Athra at Troy. But Esther, in the 13th book of his Attic history, gives us an account of Athra, different yet from all the rest, that Achilles and Patroclus overcame Paris and Thessaly, near the river Spercheius, but that Hector took and plundered the city of the Troezenians and made Athra prisoner there. And this seems a groundless tale. Now Hercules, passing by the Molossians, was entertained in his way to Aedoneus, the king, who in conversation accidentally spoke of the journey of Theseus and Pirithous into his country, of which they had designed to do, and what they were forced to suffer. Hercules was much grieved for the inglorious death of the one and the miserable condition of the other. As for Pirithous, he thought it useless to complain, but begged to have Theseus released for his sake, and obtained that favor from the king. Theseus, being thus set at liberty, returned to Athens, where his friends were not yet wholly suppressed and dedicated to Hercules, all the sacred places which the city had set apart for himself, changing their names from Thasia to Heraclea, 4 only excepted, as Philochorus writes, and wishing immediately to resume the first place in the commonwealth and manage the state as before, he soon found himself involved in factions and troubles. Those who long had hated him had now added to their hatred contempt, and the minds of the people were so generally corrupted that, instead of obeying commands with silence, they expected to be flattered into their duty. He had some thoughts to have reduced them by force, but it was overpowered by demagogues and factions, and at least despairing of any good success. And at last, despairing of any good success of his affairs in Athens, he sent away his children privately to Euboea, commending them to the care of Elephenor, the son of Chalcodon, and he himself, having solemnly cursed the people of Athens in the village of Gargetus, in which there yet remains the place called Oratorion, or the place of the cursing, sailed to Skyros, where he had lands left him by his father, and friendship, as he thought, with those of the island. Lycomedes was then king of Skyros. Theseus therefore addressed himself to him and desired to have his lands put into his possession, as designing to settle and dwell there. Though others say he came to beg his assistance against the Athenians, but Lycomedes, either jealous of the glory of so great a man, or to gratify Menestheus, having led him up to the highest cliff of the island, on the pretence of showing him from thence the lands that he desired, threw him headlong down, from the rock and killed him. Others say he fell down of himself by a slip of his foot as he was walking there, according to his custom after supper. At that time there was no notice taken, nor were any concerned for his death. But Menestheus quietly possessed the kingdom of Athens. His sons were brought up in a private condition and accompanied Elephenor to the Trojan War. But after the decease of Menestheus in that expedition, returned to Athens and recovered the government, but in succeeding ages, beside several other circumstances that moved the Athenians to honor Theseus as a demigod in the battle which was fought at Marathon against the Medes, many of the soldiers believed they saw an apparition of Theseus in arms, rushing on at the head of them against the barbarians. And after the Median War, Phado being an archon of Athens, the Athenians, consulting the oracle at Delphi, were commanded to gather together the bones of Theseus and laying them in some honorable place, keep them as sacred in the city. But it was very difficult to recover these relics, or so much as to find out the place where they lay, on account of the inhospitable and savage temper of the barbarous people that inhabited the island. Nevertheless, afterwards, when Cimon took the island, as is related in his life, and had a great ambition to find out the place where Theseus was buried, he by chance spied an eagle upon a rising ground, pecking with her beak and tearing up the earth with her talons, when on the sudden it came into his mind, as it were by some divine inspiration, to dig there and search for the home of Theseus. There were found in that place a coffin of a man of more than ordinary size, and a brazen spearhead, and a sword lying by it, all of which he took aboard his galley, and brought with him to Athens, upon which the Athenians, greatly delighted, went out to meet and receive the relics, with splendid processions and sacrifices, as if it were Theseus himself returning alive to the city. He lies interred in the middle of the city, near the present gymnasium. His tomb is a sanctuary and refuge for slaves and all those of mean condition that fly from the persecution of men in power, in memory that Theseus, while he lived, was an assister and protector of the distressed, and never refused the petitions of the afflicted that fled to him. The chief and most solemn sacrifice which they celebrated to him is kept on the 8th day of Pinapsion, on which he returned with the Athenian young men from Crete, besides which they sacrificed to him on the 8th day of every month, either because he returned from Troezen the 8th day of Hecatombaan, as Diodorus the geographer writes, or else thinking that number to be proper to him, because he was reputed to be born of Neptune, because he sacrificed to Neptune on the 8th day of every month, the number 8 being the first cube of an even number, and the double of the first square, seemed to be an emblem of the steadfast and immovable power of this entity, who from thence has the name of Asphalius and Gaiacus, that is, the establisher and stayer of the earth. And now, of course, when I say the term saint, I don't mean that, every individual that's a saint or is called a saint is worshipped. But you kind of think of that too while they develop an idea of God, and maybe that's not sufficient. And instead of maybe thinking that about God, they're like, okay, well, here's this saint that does that. And eventually maybe the saint gets its own separate cult, and they forget that it was a sanctified human being.